In this episode, the featured film tells the story of refugees fleeing war-torn Europe across the Mediterranean to the seemingly safe haven of French Morocco in North Africa, and using it as a jumping-off point to an even more safe haven of America, focuses on one of those refugees who fled the war in Europe and a shattered romance, and boasts a supporting cast of characters so well crafted and so colorful that I believe it is unmatched in all of motion picture history. These stories and more from the 22nd row. Casablanca was released in 1942. And I must say without hesitation and with no doubt whatsoever that this is my most favorite film. Now, I have lots of films I like, well over 200 films when I've done a tally of it. But for some reason, this film has resonated with me more than any other. And over the years, I've wondered why this is so. I've thought about all the ingredients that are necessary for me to like a film, and all of the films I like have most of those ingredients, just like Casablanca, but for some reason, this film just has stayed with me more than any other. And I will say cautiously that I consider this film to be among that small group of films created throughout the world to be considered a masterpiece. So my wondering about why I like this film so much has not brought any results, except for me to say that there are two elements of this film that I think are crucial to both its success and why I like it. The reason why I like this film so much, and perhaps its overall success down through the years, is the result of two main factors. One is the screenplay, that is to say, the dialogue of the film, and the other is the ensemble cast. This screenplay is without doubt my favorite, and by that again I mean the dialogue. It is poetic. And there are so many quotations from this film that have been used again and again throughout movie history, which is no accident. The other element of this film, which I believe is exceptional, is the ensemble cast. Not only are the characters described in tremendous detail, very unique, very different from one another, they have also been cast, I think, perfectly. And in fact, I believe Casablanca is greater than the sum of its parts. These two main parts, to be specific. All of the actors in this film had proven track records, were well known to audiences, but somehow they created a product that was way beyond expectations, at least from how I see it, because they weren't just good, they were terrific. And of course, having a tremendous screenplay, having a tremendous story helps that, but it was delivered just beyond expectations. I've also wondered if this finished product of Casablanca was the result of one person's vision, but I haven't seen or read anything that suggests that this is so. In fact, I think Casablanca is one of the few exceptional films in which the director is not mentioned very often. His name was Michael Curtiz, but whenever I hear someone speak about Casablanca or the many things I've read about it, it doesn't say, well, the reason why Casablanca has been so successful was because of Michael Curtiz. Now, I'm sure he had a part, and I have said many times that I'm not sure how much impact a director has on the resulting picture, but Casablanca is one of those films, I think, that all the powers that be, from producer, actors, director, and certainly the screenwriters and the source material, contributed to this magnificent result. And not unlike my comments earlier about the James Bond series and those musicians in the late 50s who sat down in a studio and laid down the track for the theme music to James Bond, I don't think they realized that, hey, we just made history, and this music is going to be remembered for the next 60 years. In the same way, after Casablanca was finished and was screened for the first time by, let's say, the producers and whoever else had a say in this film, did they sit back and say, wow, what have we just done? And I think the answer to that is no, for two reasons. First of all, Hollywood was really hitting its stride by 1942, 1941. They had been making talking pictures for, let's say, 11 or 12 years. And by 1939, they were making fabulous films. And they were making a voluminous number of films. Now, they weren't all A-list pictures. They were so-called B-list films, but they were making product. Lots and lots of product. So I think it wouldn't have been surprising for them to say, okay, we just made a terrific picture, now let's go on to the next one. Not realizing that they would make a picture that, for sake of argument, has been considered one of the best movies Hollywood ever made. I'm sure they just thought, well, that's a really good one, now let's get on to the next project. The other reason is, again, the times. Many films were being made. A-list films, B-list films. Humphrey Bogart, who was the star of Casablanca, had just come off a spectacular film that I have talked about called The Maltese Falcon. And you think, how could he possibly have topped that performance, and how could that movie have been topped with very different people involved, except for a couple of people, minor characters and Bogart. But I think Casablanca does do that. I find it, again, just because it is my favorite film, although I like The Maltese Falcon very much. At the time, 1942, it was early in the Second World War. The U.S. had not yet joined the war at the time this film was made, but by the summer of 1940, Germany had overrun almost all the countries of Europe, not including Switzerland, which was neutral. And that caused the refugee problem. People were fleeing all the countries of Europe with the exception of Spain and Portugal, and certainly France. Given that this film ended up being what it was, it's not surprising that a lot of silly things have been said about it in the years since its release by the actors involved, the writers, perhaps the director. Silly things in a fun way, in that just what they've said is not really consistent with some of the facts of the story. That's another reason why I like to take a film off the screen first and not worry about all this fun and in its own place fun noise surrounding the film. The source material for Casablanca was a play called Everybody Comes to Rick's. It was never produced, and there is a lot of talk about why it wasn't produced related to the people who were making the film. But there's a book written about this and everything else you want to know about Casablanca called Round Up the Usual Suspects. Now, this is a book written by a person called Algene Harmitz, and it talks about everything related to Casablanca and goes into great detail about the play Everybody Comes to Rick's. Now, this story has been told many times, and the people who wrote it and the people involved are long since gone again and completely forgotten. But Algene Harmitz does say that many of the great lines in Casablanca and the story itself originate in the play. So the story of Casablanca is not particularly spectacular. It's just good. It's a nice story about refugees fleeing Europe, arriving in French Morocco in the city of Casablanca to avoid the persecution or the occupation of Germany. And there's a problem. The problem is that French Morocco, of course, is governed by France, but France was occupied or defeated by Germany by the summer of 1940. But the Germans decided to occupy only half the country and let the French government occupy the southern half and its territories, just to make it easier for the Germans to do what they had to do. That part of France was called Vichy, and Vichy also controlled Morocco. Now, the problem there is that the Vichy government was somewhat, which might be an understatement, sympathetic to the Germans. And so refugees fleeing Europe were not completely safe in French Morocco, even though it was not a battlefield. It was not, there were Germans there, there were French there were people from all parts of Europe in Morocco, ostensibly safe from persecution, but the government was definitely leaning towards the Germans, which is why the refugees who came to Morocco wanted to take the next step and leave and go to Spain or Portugal, usually Portugal, and then from Portugal to America, which was, even though it would soon be a combatant in the war, there was no fighting in North America. So that would make it the safest place to go. Needless to say, in order to leave Casablanca, it would cost a fortune to get a visa. A corrupt government, and it was as simple as that. A corrupt government that decided who could leave, who couldn't leave, and usually the dollar figure rose and rose and rose. Naturally, it was a black market, and the story of Casablanca goes into that as well. So that's sort of the roundabout history of the beginning of Casablanca. There are refugees in this town on the northwest part of Africa, and most of them want to get out. The film begins with a nice little prologue and sort of sets this up, tells about the war, tells about what's happening in Europe, and describes how these refugees made their way to Casablanca. And of course, jumping from Casablanca to other parts, safer parts, took time. And for some people, they would never leave. Now, the other element of the story is that even though the Vichy government was sympathetic to Germany, there was a rebellious element of French men and women who were fighting this occupation, called the Free French. And the story is really based around this resistance movement and its successes and failures and its leaders. And within the first 5 minutes of the film, we are introduced to all these elements, which is a very nice little setup to what we're about to watch. So we have the Vichy government and its representatives in control of Casablanca. And right near the beginning of the film, we have the arrival of a German delegation, military delegation, because they are searching for one particular refugee, a legendary figure who has headed the resistance movements in many countries in Europe. And his character's name is Victor Laslo. So our prefect of police, Captain Renault, meets this German colonel, or major, I think, Major Strasser, and they're going to talk about how they're going to try to capture this refugee. And in order to do that, they're going to go to this cafe in town called Rick's. And the major says, "What is this cafe?" And he said, "Rick's? Well, everybody comes to Rick's," is what the captain's response is. And that sets up the next stage of the film, and where we go to Rick's Cafe. And in Rick's Cafe, we have our hero, our star, Richard Blaine, known as Rick. And it comes in where he is the proprietor and the owner of this cafe, and he is unquestionably the boss. And we learn something about the nature of refugees living in a temporary or semi-permanent state, and that people who were once bankers, financiers, or very important individuals in a refugee city would do whatever it would take to stay alive and make a living. So that's where this whole cast of characters comes into play, and how well defined they are and how fun they are. And Casablanca does a great job of describing the captain, Renault, played by a fellow named Claude Rains, a wonderful actor who had a tremendous career and has some of the best lines in the entire movie. Bogart, of course, is Rick, and there are many more. And there are two in particular that are worth mentioning, of these minor characters, Sidney Greenstreet and Peter Lorre. Peter Lorre was this diminutive fellow with a thick accent, and Sidney Greenstreet was an oversized fellow with sort of a British accent. And they are both characters in this film. The beginning of the scene in the cafe, it beautifully introduces our main character, some of our minor characters who again are fun, and there's just tremendous dialogue between them all that is, I find, funny and clever, and it just makes my jaw drop every time I see it. We're also introduced to the other element of the story, which is critical to the advancement of the story and what happens in the next 90 minutes of this film. And that is the arrival of this underground superstar named Victor Laslo. But Victor Laslo comes in with this gorgeous woman on his arm. Her name is Ilsa. In fact, her name is Ilsa Lund. And they find a table, and they're looking for someone because they have some private dealings to do with what underground people do. So there we have it set up. We're in the cafe, which is the center of all the action in in the movie. We have introduced several of the minor characters, the doorman, the croupier at the roulette table, the barman, the servers. They're all there, and they all have little moments in the film which are so economical but so revealing of what the character is, as well as the captain of police, Captain Renault, who is a ladies' man and just so wonderfully sculpted, this character. You just can't help but like him despite the fact he's a bit of a rogue. I'll leave the story there because there are certain reasons why Rick is in Morocco. Well, of course, he was being chased by the Germans because he ran guns and did other things for resistance work. But he also had a terrible romantic experience in Paris just before the Germans occupied the city. And so he had to leave France for that reason as well, to get away from it all, and finds this spot in Casablanca. I can't really remember where I first saw the film. Was it in a theater? I think it was on television was the first time I saw it. But I did see it in a theater, in an auditorium at university, in a packed house, and it was a wonderful night. It might have been the first time I saw it, but it was a terrific scene, full of undergraduate students, a couple of cinema professors, and we were in this very large auditorium with this makeshift screen. I don't know how they got these prints of this film, but the university always had a huge library of prints of many, many wonderful films, and they certainly had this one. So that was a night I've never forgotten. It was just a wonderful experience. Another time I saw the film, around the same time, was again in this repertory theater that I would go to on a regular basis, where I mentioned before, I saw West Side Story there and other films. But I saw Casablanca there, and it was the same kind of jaded crowd, skeptical. What's the big deal with this film, Casablanca, this 1942, this old black and white film with people we don't know, telling another story about the Second World War. What's the big deal? So Casablanca started, and right near the end, there's a spectacularly dramatic scene, a very, very famous scene that has been used in countless films ever since this movie came out. But it really is a critical moment in the film. And what happened was the film broke and the lights came up. And the result was I was just flabbergasted. The audience rose in unison in anger. They were so into this movie, and at this most critical moment, the film broke, and they howled and screamed and demanded to get it fixed. And actually, whoever the projectionist was, got it fixed fairly quickly. It wasn't more than 2 or 3 minutes. And everybody sat back down and watched the rest of the film. So I thought at that time, well, that is the power of this movie. No matter how jaded you might be, no matter how much you don't like watching old films, and yes, it takes time to get used to them, and Casablanca might take time if you've never seen a film, black and white film from 70 years ago. But once you watch it more than once, you are into this film like I have been into this film ever since. One other time I saw this film that I'll never forget was incredible, and that was on television. And I mentioned in one of my very early episodes that in the early 70s, late 60s and early 70s, movies were all over television. They needed to fill up airspace. So there would be the big show of the week, the Thursday night movie of the week, the Sunday night movie of the week, Saturday night at the movies. But there were also the local stations, not the network, but the local stations would show films. And there was one, I think, called Tuesday Afternoon at the Movies, which would take place before the local news. So it could be 4 o'clock to 5:30 could have been the allotted time. And so I said, oh, well, I'm home. And I thought, well, this is kind of cool. Casablanca on TV in the afternoon. Now I'll add something. This is a little bit of a spoiler alert, but not too much. Casablanca does have a flashback sequence. And in that, it explains a tremendous amount of why Rick is in Morocco. So I'm watching this. I'd seen the film a couple of times already, and I'm watching this afternoon showing. And because it's a 90-minute time slot full of commercials, they cut the entire flashback sequence. So the point where the flashback starts and the flashback ends is about 10 seconds of film space, and the 10 or 15 minutes or less that is the flashback, gone. I'll never forget it. It was just incredible. And of course, the local stations had free rein to do whatever they needed to do to slot these movies into their allotted time spots. And of course, they made decisions like, oh, we got to get this film down to, I don't know, 65 minutes or something, and they just cut it. The last time I saw it in a theater was in the early 90s. It was Valentine's Day, and as a promotion, a theater in downtown Toronto decided to show Casablanca. And it was a big deal. They had, they gave out gifts, sort of, in the theater beforehand. It was kind of a date night. And it was a chance to see Casablanca in a first-rate theater. This was a regular movie theater, long since gone, sad to say. It was called the Cumberland Theater in this sweet old town where I'm from. And they had a little element to it that I thought was kind of funny. And with all humility, I have to tell you about this. There was a trivia contest just before they started the film. And they'd ask various questions, and it was a well-informed audience. And what happened was they'd ask a question, and then if you knew the answer, you put your hand up, and there might be 10 or 15 or 20 hands up. And as they progressed, the questions got harder and harder. Well, I had already seen the film many, many times, and I'd also read the book by Eugene Harmetz. And finally, down to the last couple of questions, the very last question was, what was the name of the play that the movie was based on? And mine was the only hand that went up, because I just read the book quite recently. And so they said, you're the other one, what was it? And you had to get it right. And I said, Everybody Comes to Rick's. And I won a really, really nice voucher to a very expensive restaurant. And that was a pretty good Valentine's night for me. So we have this screenplay, and it would be probably wrong of me to go through all the wonderful lines of this film. The quotations from this movie go on and on and on. The music of the film is also well regarded. There's a piano player who is Rick's buddy, works with him, is his, you might say valet, you might say partner, you might say he just goes everywhere he goes. His name is Sam. And it doesn't matter when you read the background stuff about Casablanca. Did he sing? Was it his voice? Did he play the piano? Was it somebody else playing? Who cares? In the movie, Sam is primarily a piano player, singer, but is also Rick's friend through thick and thin. And he sings a song that has stayed with the movie business ever since. And that song is called As Time Goes By. It was written before this movie was made, so it wasn't a product of the film, but it just works in this film. And there also is a plot line to this, which is important for this song, and very critical in the movie. So there's some nice piano playing and some fun stuff, and very typical of the period. But there's another scene in this film which makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. And I once again have to quote Sir Kenneth Clark, who says, "You don't have a pulse if this doesn't get to you." And it's a scene, because in the cafe there are German soldiers, there are French policemen. I don't think there are any French soldiers per se, but there's French policemen, there's Italian officials. So there's a real hodgepodge, but there's a lot of French citizens, because this is French Morocco. So there's a lot of French citizens. Well, Victor Laslo is in the cafe this night, and he's been talking to Rick about various things, which I'll leave to the movie. And he hears from Rick's office, he hears the Germans singing. Well, militaries from the dawn of time have sung together. The soldiers, whether they're marching or just hanging around the cafe, they sing songs. And so the German delegation is singing a very German militaristic kind of song. So Victor Laslo has to challenge this. So he goes to the house band that's in the cafe, and he tells them to play the Marseillaise. And I'll leave it right there. And that scene is just brilliant. It is just undeniably brilliant, and as far as my opinion goes. Every time I watch this movie, I can't wait for this scene to come up. And I have to say, probably because of this film, but for other reasons, my favorite national anthem, without a doubt, is the Marseillaise. You know, everybody loves their own country's anthem, more or less, but I don't think any of them hold a candle to the Marseillaise. So this is another of many, many, many spectacular scenes, which are hard for me to describe without going into too much detail. Another great thing about Casablanca, which is maybe why it has done so well over the years, is I think it was way ahead of its time. It looks at some very adult themes, as well as the very difficult themes of refugees and war. But there are other adult themes in this film. There's a black market for visas to get out of Morocco. Well, that's nothing new. There's always black markets in war, but it's well handled here. But there's also another element. As I said, Captain Renault is a bit of a rogue and a ladies' man, and he also knows that for certain favors with women, he will grant visas at reasonable prices. And there is an exchange between Rick and one of these women who is trying, she and her husband are trying to get out of Morocco, out of Casablanca, and she goes to Rick to talk to him about this. And every time I watch this film, I see something new, or I hear something that I hadn't heard before. It is way ahead of its time. It's quite risque. It certainly is funny, but it also is incredibly compelling. And what I like about Casablanca is scene after scene after scene in this movie is just like that. They take ordinary scenes of people leaving a cafe or of people coming into a cafe, and they add a couple of lines of dialogue or something, or they just twist it a little bit, and then it becomes memorable, and it's just spectacular. It's a word I use too much for this, but it's hard for me to be restrained when talking about what a terrific film this is. Enough to say that, as I said, scene after scene after scene, there's electricity in this film. It's never slowed down. There are quiet moments in it. There's the flashback sequence, which has so many quotations that are used again and again and again. There is tete-a-tetes between Victor, Laslo, and Rick. There's lots of conversation between Captain Renault, who is an admirer of Rick's. They're friends. And of course, all these lesser characters who move in and out of the story are funny, are clever, and in some cases tragic. So all of this leads up to a flashpoint because, of course, Victor, Laslo, and Ilsa have to leave Casablanca. They have to get out of the French influence because Vichy French is pro-German, and he has to continue doing what he needs to do, so he can't stay in Casablanca. So that's where the energy of the film, the excitement, the suspense of the film builds, because will he get out of Casablanca or won't he get out of Casablanca? Will he be able to take Ilsa with him, and what exactly is her relationship to this superstar Victor Laslo? And how does Rick fit into all this? Because Rick is a very powerful guy in Casablanca. He's world weary and street smart. He knows his way around, and he can get things done. Maybe he's going to help Laslo. Maybe he won't help Laslo. We don't know. And so the movie builds to this wonderful climax at the airport. Again, a scene that has been played over again and again and again in so many films and used so many times humorously, seriously. And this scene at the airport creeps up in many, many, many films in the last 70 years. So we have our climax. Some tremendous things happen. It is wonderfully executed because we really don't know what's going to happen. And then the movie ends on another spectacularly famous quotation that has been used again and again and again. So one or two great lines in a film for me is nice. Gee, that's great. That was really clever how they said that. Bogart saying at the end of The Maltese Falcon, if I can say that, what was this statuette? The cop asks him, and he says, "The stuff that dreams are made of," which is a quotation from Shakespeare. And in this movie has dozens of great lines. And I must confess, I'll have to share one of them with you. It's not a spoiler alert, really. Sidney Greenstreet plays another nightclub owner who is heavily into the black market and who does get people in and out of Casablanca for a very high fee, getting them visas to get out for a very high fee, is talking to Victor Laslo. And they say, and he's talking to someone. He says, what are the chances of Victor Laslo getting a visa and getting out of Casablanca? And he says, it will take a miracle for Victor Laslo to leave Casablanca, and the Germans have outlawed miracles. And I have to say that's one of my favorite quotations of all time. So Casablanca definitely speaks to the refugee problem, definitely acknowledges that a war is going on. As I mentioned, the war really heated up in about the year this film was released, but not the time it was made. By the end of 1941, the U.S. was in the war, and it became a global war rather than a European war, with the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. So it isn't, I would say, a war film. It is a film about refugees and how they lived their lives in a city that it was sort of safe from the war. Certainly the Mediterranean helped to make that a safer place, but not totally safe, with the Vichy government being sympathetic to Germany. So there isn't too much war involved. It's more character-driven. It's more about this story. It's a great story, but not earth-shattering. It's a story of lost love and failed romance and desperation of people trying to flee a horrific confrontation in Europe, trying to find some way to get to a safe place and start their lives up again. And that's what makes it, I think, lasting, because war films, some of them don't survive the test of time, others do, many don't. But this is a character-driven movie, and it does survive the test of time. So though some people stay in Casablanca, such as Rick, because they really don't have any reason to go anywhere else, maybe they've made a life for themselves, however precarious, most of them are trying to leave, and it is very, very difficult to leave Casablanca. Will Victor Laslo be able to leave Casablanca and continue his resistance movement? Will Ilsa go with him? Will she be allowed to go with him? As time has gone by, I've lost track of how many times I've seen this film, and I enjoy it just as much every time I watch it, looking forward to those spectacular scenes, clever, witty, fun, the emotions in the film. When you see a tough guy like Rick being vulnerable, it's just incredible. My enjoyment of the film remains undiminished, no matter how many times I see it. And I always look forward to going back to Casablanca and enjoying this film yet again from the 22nd row.